All right, hi guys. So we're going to continue talking about the people who played the biggest role in World War II. So before we actually can even talk about the war itself, I really wanted to give you guys a foundation of who the leaders were that were making the decisions throughout the war. So yesterday talked about the dictators that were coming to power. So we had dictatorships in Spain and Italy and Germany and Japan and the Soviet Union. So a lot of the world was being taken over by dictatorships throughout the 1930s. So I wanted to show you guys this map first and foremost to kind of give you an idea of what was going on in Europe. So all of those countries in purple were dictatorships or led by dictators. The ones in pink were that used to be democracies, but they were dismantled by dictatorships in 1938 until 1940. So mostly Hitler and the Nazis were taking over those. So the only remaining democracies were Switzerland, Great Britain, Ireland, Sweden, and Finland. So there were really only 5 countries in Europe that were still democracies and still free from a dictatorship. So that was kind of very quickly done. So once Hitler started World War II and started taking over countries, he was just cruising all over Europe and taking over countries left and right. And that map shows you the results of that. So we're going to talk about the Allied leaders. So the leaders of those countries that were able to remain free. So we're going to start by talking about the United States. So our president at the time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the president all throughout the 1930s through the Great Depression. We talked about him quite a lot. He's the one who came up with the New Deal. And now as World War II is starting, he's going to take over control of the war. So before America got involved in the war was already going on. So the war starts in 1939. And America doesn't get involved until 1941. So in between that time, those couple years where the United States is not involved in the war, FDR really wanted to support England, who he thought needed to win and needed to beat Hitler. Because obviously FDR, even though America wasn't in the war technically, we definitely didn't want Hitler and the Nazis to win the war. So we really wanted to support whoever was fighting them, and that was England at the time. So America ended up supporting England through what we call the Lend-Lease Act before we even entered World War II. So basically we were lending out or leasing war materials, ships, anything that they could use with the exception of troops. We were not sending troops over. We were just sending any war supplies that they might need. And that was before we entered the war. Now, once Pearl Harbor happened, so on December 7th of 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. This is when we officially enter the war. And when we do enter the war, we enter on the side of England and France and the Allies. And Roosevelt's the one that supervised this transition we have in the United States to a wartime economy. And that's what technically brings us out of the Great Depression is the war. And the fact that we needed to amp up production so much and we were able to make a lot of money and give jobs to people either through the military service or through the factories and things needed to build war supplies. So that was a big benefit, I guess, for the United States. FDR was super active in planning the war strategy against Germany and Japan. So he was not the type to sit back and just let his military advisors do everything. FDR was very involved and wanted to make the decisions. And he was not one to just sit back and let other people make decisions for him. So this is a picture of what we call the Big Three. So you have in the middle there is FDR. To the right is Joseph Stalin. I talked about him yesterday. He was the dictator of the Soviet Union. And then on the left, you have Winston Churchill. So Russia, or the Soviet Union, the United States, and England were the 3 countries that were the most powerful in the Allies, and they were the ones that were making all the decisions in the fight against Hitler and the Nazis. So we call them the Big Three. So the next guy we're going to talk about is General Dwight Eisenhower. So he was another American. He would also go on to become president in the 1950s. So Eisenhower led successful invasions in North Africa and Italy. So that's kind of where America started their fighting. We're in North Africa and Italy because Hitler had Europe pretty wrapped up very early on. So it would have been kind of like a suicide mission to try to just immediately go in and invade Europe, because Hitler would have won that very easily. So instead, we're going to go along the outskirts, and we were going to take out North Africa and Italy and take out the Italians so that Hitler didn't have that ally anymore. Eisenhower is eventually named Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe. So not only the commander of the United States forces, but all of our allies were under his command too. So the French, the English, the Australians, Canadians, anybody who were part of the Allies were under the command of Eisenhower. He's also the one who planned and led the Allied invasion of France. We call it Operation Overlord, but you guys have probably heard of it by its more common name, which is D-Day. So he is the one who led that first invasion into France to try to kick Hitler out of France and eventually the rest of Europe. We also call that the invasion of Normandy. So you might hear it called Operation Overlord, D-Day, or Normandy, all talking about the same battle. These are just some pictures of Eisenhower with his troops. He was very well liked. There he is with his advisors. Here's a quote from Eisenhower. He said, "I hate wars. Only a soldier who has lived it can. Only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity." So it's kind of ironic that one of the greatest generals we've had in the history of America actually hated war and was not, really supportive of it because he saw how brutal it was. Next guy we're going to talk about is another very famous general in American history, General George Patton. So Patton, he led what we call Operation Torch in the invasion of North Africa. So again, America started out our fighting in Africa because we couldn't just go in guns a-blazing into Europe because Hitler was there waiting. So we started out in Africa. Then once we moved into Europe, Patton commanded the U.S. Third Army after the Normandy invasion, or D-Day. He was very inspirational. So he was able to inspire his troops to victories across France and into Nazi Germany. So he was the one who kind of led the way for the Allied troops and was really pushing hard to get a victory. They had a parade for him when he got home. He was super popular. There's a movie about him. There's many books written about him. A lot of people consider him one of the greatest generals in history. So one of his quotes, he said, "Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge, brings out all that is best, it removes all that is base. All men are afraid in battle. The coward is the one who lets his fear overcome his sense of duty. Duty is the essence of manhood." Last American we're going to talk about today is another general, Douglas MacArthur. There's a picture of him leading his way. So he was actually the leader of the Pacific. So America had two groups fighting, or two fronts, we call it. We have the European front, and that was led by Eisenhower and Patton. And we have the Pacific front fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean, and that was led by this guy, General Douglas MacArthur. So he was the supreme commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific. So he was leading the fight against the Japanese. Now, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they didn't just attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. They actually attacked several other military bases in the Pacific that the U.S. held. And the Philippines was one of those bases. And they were technically a colony of the United States at the time. And that's where General Douglas MacArthur was. So when Japan attacked, the Americans were just completely overwhelmed because it was a surprise attack, and they weren't able to hold the Japanese off. So instead of just attacking and running away or leaving like the Japanese did at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese actually attacked and took the Philippines. So they overtook the whole island, or the whole groups of islands. So General Douglas MacArthur was actually forced to flee. Like, he didn't want to leave behind his troops, but they knew, being the supreme commander, he needed to be evacuated. So he was able to run away and get away before the Japanese actually took the Philippines completely. But he really hated that. And as he was leaving, he's like, "I promise to the people of the Philippines, I will return, I will come back." And that was kind of his goal throughout the whole war, was to get back to the Philippines and rescue those people that he was kind of forced to leave behind. So throughout the war, he was able to lead forces through New Guinea and back to the Philippines. So we use what we call island hopping in the Pacific during World War II. So they went from island to island and took island after island back from Japan. And that's what Douglas MacArthur did. And eventually he was able to come back to the Philippines. And that picture I showed you here is actually him returning to the Philippines when they took it back from the Japanese. And he was kind of dramatic. He was like, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. I have saved you." He was a little over the top, but it was a big accomplishment for him. He's also the person that accepted and signed Japan's official surrender in September of 1945. So when we officially, defeat the Japanese, he's the one that is there to be a part of that official surrender. So one of his quotes, he says, "The soldier above all others prays for peace, for it is the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war." So those were the Americans that we're going to talk about. Now we're going to get into the other leaders and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. So he was eventually England's prime minister. But before he became prime minister, he had been warning the government in England about Nazi Germany. So before World War II even started, before he was prime minister, he's telling the current prime minister, a guy named Neville Chamberlain, "You need to watch out. You need to stop Germany now. Hitler's not going to stop. Something needs to be done." He was warning them over and over. And Neville Chamberlain and the other leaders of England were like, "You're full of it. You're just a crazy old man. Nothing's going to happen. If we just let Hitler take these couple countries, he'll be fine. He'll be satisfied. That'll be enough." Well, that didn't happen. Of course, Hitler wasn't satisfied. He continued to take over country after country, and eventually we have the war. So when that happened, Neville Chamberlain, who was the prime minister, ended up resigning because people blamed him for getting them in this situation, for allowing Hitler to get as much as he did at the start of World War II. So that's how Winston Churchill ends up becoming prime minister, was when Neville Chamberlain resigned. So when he becomes prime minister, he is like a no-nonsense kind of guy. He's refusing any armistice with Nazi Germany. He wouldn't even talk to Hitler. No, not even a thought went into surrendering. And it was very kind of controversial because at that point, England was the only country in Europe left standing, and Hitler was focusing completely on England. And Hitler basically thought, like, this guy must be a joke. He needs to just surrender because there's no way that we can be stopped. But Winston Churchill and the British held on, and eventually they held out long enough, and the US joined and started helping out. And as you know, Hitler ends up losing. So Winston Churchill ended up giving really inspirational speeches and broadcasts over the radio throughout the war, and that's what really inspired the British people to keep going and to keep fighting. They, didn't surrender, even though Hitler and the Nazis would bomb all parts of England every single night, over and over and over again. Like tons and tons of bombs are being dropped. And the English still didn't give in, and they still didn't surrender. So that was a pretty good accomplishment. Next guy is another Englishman, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. He was the commander of the British 8th Army. He led forces through North Africa and the victory at El Alamein, which is like a turning point in the war with Africa. So up until that point, the Allies had been losing battles in Africa. El Alamein was a victory for the Allies. So after that, they started winning. So we call that a turning point. He also led the Allied invasions of Sicily and Italy to take out Benito Mussolini and the Italians. And he was also in command of Allied forces for D-Day. So he was all over the place and commanding troops in all parts of the war. There he is with Eisenhower. And our next guy, Charles de Gaulle, who's the only Frenchman we're going to talk about today. So Charles de Gaulle is from France. He was the one who commanded the French Armored Division against Nazi Germany. He refused to accept France's surrender, and he led the Free French government in exile. And he commanded the French resistance from England and North Africa. So right when World War II starts, Germany goes and invades France, and they end up having to surrender within like 2 weeks. Like, it's very, very quick. Well, Charles de Gaulle and a lot of the French troops were able to escape and evacuate into England and Africa. So they were able to continue the fight from outside of France. So even though France fell, there was still resistance against the Nazis, and Charles de Gaulle was the leader of the French who were able to escape. And even though he wasn't technically in France, he was still leading France from afar. So he was a military leader for France. He didn't get quite the respect from the other three, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, that he wanted. He was kind of like the annoying little brother almost, that they just kind of wanted to go away, but he wanted to be included. So they had kind of a rocky relationship. So there's a picture of Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, FDR, and a military advisor. Here's a picture of Churchill and de Gaulle when they did finally take back France from Hitler and the Nazis. That's in Paris. All right, so those are the Allied leaders. So those were the people who were leading the way for the Allies. So now that we have this, we know who the dictators were, we know who the Allies were, we have the teams essentially, so who's fighting who. Now we can start getting into what actually happened in the war and the outcome of the war. So if you haven't already been doing it while I was talking, make sure you go back into the Google Doc that I posted on Classroom and complete the notes for that and get that turned in by the end of the school day today. So make sure that you get that done. And let me know if you guys have any questions.